The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 stands as the most seismic and sudden social upheaval in English history, a volcanic eruption of popular fury that momentarily shook the foundations of the monarchy and irrevocably fractured the ancient medieval social order, demonstrating the terrifying power that could be wielded when the common populace united under the radical banner of equality and desperation. Its genesis was not a singular event, but a profound, decades-long crisis of economy, disease, and political repression that had fundamentally destabilized the kingdom. The true source of the revolt lay in the biological cataclysm of the Black Death, which swept through England between 1347 and 1351. This plague decimated the population, killing perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire workforce, thereby upending the immutable laws of supply and demand that had governed feudalism for centuries. Suddenly, the surviving peasants and laborers held unprecedented and unexpected leverage. With the scarcity of hands available to work, the land wages soared, and the rigid bonds of serfdom, the legal obligation that tied a peasant to a Lord E.S. manor, began to fray as workers demanded freedom and better pay. The panicked ruling aristocracy, clinging desperately to the decaying feudal structure that guaranteed their wealth, attempted to roll back this natural economic correction through increasingly oppressive legislation. The most notorious of these measures was the Statute of Labours of 1351, which attempted the economically impossible to cap wages at the levels they had been before the Black Death and strictly enforce the age-old obligations of serfdom. This act of legislative repression was seen by the commoners not merely as an inconvenience, but as a deliberate and profound injustice, an attempt to deny them the only tangible benefit, increased value for their labour, that had resulted from their survival. This deep-seated structural resentment was compounded by the endless, hugely expensive, and largely unsuccessful campaigns of the 100 Years' War in France, which drained the royal treasury dry and led to chronic mismanagement, corruption, and military humiliation within the minority government ruling in the name of the boy king Richard II, who was only 14 years old at the time of the rebellion. The man who embodied this corrupt misrule and became the primary target of public hatred was the king's immensely wealthy and politically dominating uncle, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, whose luxurious palace and vast influence made him the symbol of aristocratic excess. The ultimate catalyst, the specific spark that ignited this tinderbox of social and economic oppression, was the imposition of the third and most ruinous poll tax in 1381. While two previous versions of the tax had been levied, the third was uniquely burdensome, as it was assessed as a uniform, fixed sum of 1 shilling per head for every person over the age of 15, regardless of their wealth or poverty. This meant the richest baron paid the same amount as the poorest peasant laborer, making the tax crushingly heavy for the artisans and laborers who were already struggling under fixed wages and rising costs. This tax was notoriously inefficiently collected, leading the government to send out new, aggressive commissioners to enforce payment and uncover widespread evasion. It was this bureaucratic intrusion into the daily lives of the communities, an act perceived as punitive and arbitrary, that the communities met with immediate and violent defiance. The rebellion officially began in May 1381 in the small village of Fobbing, Essex, when the local commissioner, Thomas Bampton, arrived to enforce payment. The villagers, already organized and defiant, forcibly drove him and his clerks out of the county, sparking a spontaneous but rapidly coordinating uprising across Essex and into neighboring Kent. The revolt then gained its revolutionary leader and a crucial early symbolic incident in Dartford, Kent, where a tax collector allegedly insulted the daughter of a local Tyler during an intrusive inspection aimed at verifying ages and numbers in the household. This Tyler, universally believed to be Wat Tyler himself, killed the official, instantly transforming an isolated act of resistance into a movement of organized defiance against the Crown's agents. The philosophical and spiritual core of the movement was found in the person of John Ball, a radical itinerant priest whose revolutionary, highly popular sermons had already seen him excommunicated and imprisoned multiple times for his dissenting views. Ball preached a radical form of Christian and social equality, famously posing the rhetorical question that encapsulated the entire rebellion as philosophy and became its rallying cry. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? This potent call for a classless society, asserting that all men were descended from a common stock, and that the inequality of property and title was a man-made corruption, transcended mere economic grievance, and gave the revolt a cohesive revolutionary ideology, inspiring the peasants to dismantle the entire feudal hierarchy. By early June, two massive armed contingents of peasants, labourers and radical artisans from Essex and Kent were marching towards London, swelling their ranks as they moved and destroying manorial records and debt instruments along the way. Their immediate objectives were clear and focused: to abolish the poll tax, utterly extinguish the practice of serfdom forever, execute the specific corrupt officials and ministers they held responsible for the kingdom's suffering, and secure a face-to-face confrontation with the young King Richard II. On June 13, 1381, the combined rebel armies reached the gates of London. The capital's civic authorities were fatally divided. The wealthier merchants feared the rebels and their egalitarian aims, while the poorer artisans and apprentices largely sympathized with the cause. In this moment of indecision, the gates of London Bridge were opened and the city descended into a state of intense, purposeful chaos. The rebels, demonstrating a remarkable degree of control and focus, knew exactly who their enemies were. They systematically sought out and destroyed symbols of the oppressive regime, most notably torching the opulent Savoy Palace, the London residence of the hated John of Gaunt, which they utterly annihilated, famously smashing all the Duke's plate and jewels to deny the nobles any profit from the wreckage. They also targeted law courts, legal archives, and houses belonging to known moneylenders and Flemish immigrants, whom they often associated with unfair competition and the regime's corruption. The mob then converged on the Tower of London, where the king, his mother, and his highest officials, including the Lord Chancellor and Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon of Sudbury, and the treasurer, Sir Robert Hales, had taken refuge in what they believed was the impenetrable royal fortress. Under immense public pressure and fearing a prolonged siege, the young King Richard II was reluctantly persuaded to agree to meet the rebels at Mile End, a field just outside the city walls. At this first, momentous confrontation on June 14th, the 14-year-old king, advised by his remaining loyal councillors, listened to the rebels' demands. Richard, displaying a precocious political instinct, agreed to almost everything they asked for. He granted full royal pardons to all rebels, solemnly declared the abolition of serfdom throughout England, and fixed the land rent for all tenants at a nominal 4d per acre. Many of the less radical men, primarily from Essex, believing they had secured their goals and having received signed royal charters confirming their freedom, dispersed and headed home, critically weakening the overall rebel force. However, the more radical Kentish contingent, still under the charismatic, uncompromising leadership of Wat Tyler, remained, demanding even more fundamental changes that went far beyond mere economic reform. Furthermore, while the king was distracted at Mile End, a separate and terrifying event unfolded back at the Tower of London. A contingent of rebels, having entered the fortress through the seemingly unguarded postern, or perhaps with the connivance of sympathetic guards, dragged out the high-ranking officials. Archbishop Sudbury, the primary architect of the universally hated poll tax and a symbol of ecclesiastical wealth, and Treasurer Hales were immediately and brutally executed on Tower Hill. Their heads then mounted on pikes as a chilling display of the rebels' power and commitment to vengeance against the Crown's administrators. The severity of this political violence sent shockwaves through the ruling elite, showing the total collapse of royal authority. The rebellion reached its absolute climax and decisive turning point the following day, June 15th, at Smithfield, a large open area adjacent to the cattle markets. Here, Wat Tyler, representing the most extreme revolutionary faction of the revolt, presented his final, uncompromising set of demands directly to King Richard II. Tyler's demands now included not just the abolition of serfdom and the reversal of the hated laws, but a complete societal restructuring, the disendowment of the church and the confiscation of its vast land holdings for redistribution, the abolition of all game laws, and crucially, the removal of all noble lords save the king himself, effectively calling for an end to the entire aristocratic and feudal system. During this highly personalized, extremely tense negotiation, Wat Tyler behaved in a manner deemed dangerously insolent, allegedly drinking heavily in the king's presence and resting his hand upon his dagger in a defiant gesture. The atmosphere was brittle and explosive. The critical moment arrived when William Walworth, the fiercely loyal mayor of London who was present with the king, saw an opportunity and perceived the king's life to be in imminent danger from Tyler Champily's radical posture. Walworth rode forward and swiftly stabbed Wat Tyler, mortally wounding him. Tyler attempted to ride back to his men but collapsed and died moments later in the nearby hospital of St. Bartholomew. In the ensuing, terrifying chaos, the rebels, seeing their leader struck down by treachery, began to draw their bows, preparing for immediate revenge and a massacre of the royal party. It was in this moment of pure existential crisis that the 14-year-old King Richard II displayed one of the greatest acts of personal courage in English monarchical history. Riding forward alone, putting his life directly in front of the enraged mob, he spoke with extraordinary conviction and authority, crying out, "I am your king, I will be your leader, follow me into the fields." This audacious, decisive act of personal bravery, diverting the mob's anger and offering himself as a replacement leader, combined with the profound shock of Tyler's death and the general confusion, successfully dispersed the main body of the rebel army. Lacking their charismatic leader, and having been promised immediate relief and the charters of freedom by the king himself, the remaining peasants were persuaded to leave London. The promise, however, was immediately and brutally broken. Once the rebel armies had dispersed and Richard's position was secure, thanks to the rapid gathering of loyal noble retinues and the raising of the London militia, the royal forces led by Richard himself and his loyal nobles began a swift and utterly ruthless suppression across Essex and Kent. The king summarily revoked all the charters and pardons granted at Mile End, famously declaring to the surviving peasants, "Villains ye are and villains ye shall remain." A wave of bloody retribution followed. Commissions of Oyer and Terminer were dispatched across the counties, granting judges extraordinary powers to try and execute rebels. Hundreds of peasants were hunted down, summarily tried, and hanged, often in the very villages where the revolt had started. John Bull was quickly captured, subjected to a show trial for treason, and brutally hanged, drawn, and quartered, his head, like those of Sudbury and Hales, being displayed publicly as a warning. Despite the immediate, comprehensive, and brutal failure of the revolt and the total suppression of the rebels' physical power, the ultimate, long-term impact of Wat Tyler's rebellion proved to be profound and irreversible. The aristocracy had been deeply and fundamentally terrified by the common people's capacity for organization, violence, and revolutionary ideology. The rebellion demonstrated that the old feudal order was functionally and politically unsustainable, a lesson learned far more effectively than any act of parliament. Though the aristocracy in parliament refused to legally ratify the abolition of serfdom, the practice of commutation, where labor service was exchanged for cash rent, accelerated rapidly in the decades that followed, effectively marking the beginning of the end for serfdom in England. The poll tax itself was never successfully levied again, having proven itself to be a politically impossible instrument of revenue. More significant than the economic changes was the psychological and political legacy. For the first time in English history, the common people had dared to challenge the divine right of kings and the entire hierarchical structure of society, demonstrating a collective political will and embedding the dangerous revolutionary idea of radical equality into the consciousness of the nation, an idea that would continue to resurface and challenge authority in the English Civil War and beyond.